But there's one version of Titanic we have never seen until this morning.
That's right. Experts have used special technology to map the entire ship on the ocean floor and create its digital twin.
They say the deep sea holds its breath, but 110 years later, the rust is finally talking. We've all seen the sepia-toned postcards of the Unsinkable Queen, but a fresh cache of recovered imagery suggests we weren't just sold a ticket, we were sold a narrative. From warped hull plates that shouldn't be there to shadows that defy the official blueprints, the math isn't adding up. Is it time to admit the official history was just the first layer of paint? The smoke before the steam. Now, before we get into the iceberg did it of it all, we have to talk about the fire that was already burning before the first champagne bottle even shattered against the hull. Most people think the Titanic left Southampton as a pristine, silver-spooned miracle of engineering. In reality, she left the dock with a literal inferno raging in her gut. Imagine this. You're a first-class passenger sipping top-shelf brandy on the promenade deck, but 60 feet below your polished Oxfords in coal bunker number 6, a 3-story smolder has been gutting the ship for days. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory whispered in a dark pub. It's a documented, soot-stained fact buried in the stoker's logs. We're talking about a spontaneous combustion fire, a common enough nightmare in the coal era that reached temperatures nearing 1,000 degrees Celsius. That is white heat territory, folks. Why does this matter 110 years later? Because the official story treats the iceberg like a surgical, unavoidable strike. But a fresh look at the pre-departure photographs, specifically those grainy shots taken at the Belfast docks, reveals a distinct 30-foot dark streak along the hull's starboard side. It's located exactly where the iceberg would later make its fatal contact. Coincidence? Not in a world governed by physics. Think about the metallurgy of 1912 for a second. When you cook high-carbon steel at those temperatures for days on end, and then suddenly quench it with the 28 degrees Fahrenheit water of the North Atlantic, the metal doesn't just bend. It undergoes a molecular tantrum. It becomes brittle fracture prone, meaning it shatters like a dropped teacup rather than denting like a modern car bumper. The 1912 British inquiry conveniently brushed the fire under the rug to protect the White Star Line's plummeting stock, but the warped bulkhead tells a much grittier story. They knew the ship's structural integrity was compromised before they even cleared the English Channel. They didn't hit an iceberg with a perfect ship. They hit it with a vessel that was already cooking itself from the inside out, turning its unsinkable skin into a shell of burnt sugar. But if the hull was already a ticking time bomb, why in the world were they pushing the triple expansion engines to their absolute limit in a known ice field? The Great Switch. If the fire in the coal bunker was the hidden fracture in the ship's physical integrity, the Olympic swap is the fracture in its very identity. To understand this, we have to stop looking at the Titanic as an isolated miracle and start looking at it as a piece of corporate property owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company. Enter the Olympic, the Titanic's older, nearly identical sister ship. A year before the Unsinkable disaster, the Olympic had a nasty run-in with the HMS Hawke, a British cruiser that took a massive bite out of the Olympic's hull. The damage was catastrophic not just to the steel, but to the finances of the White Star Line. Because the Olympic was found at fault for the collision, the insurance companies weren't cutting a check. Imagine the board meetings in 1911. One ship is a mangled, uninsurable liability, and her sister, the Titanic, is a brand new asset sitting right next to her in the same dry dock. This is where things starts to look remarkably convenient. When you look at the grainy pre-voyage photographs through a forensic lens, certain architectural glitches begin to emerge. The Olympic originally had 14 portholes on her forward sea deck. The Titanic was designed with 16. Yet as the Titanic sat at the dock for her maiden voyage, those same photographs show a sudden, inexplicable shift to 14 portholes. Why would a master shipbuilder change the structural spacing of portholes at the 11th hour? Furthermore, the nameplates on the wreck itself have long been a point of contention. Divers have noted that beneath the raised letters spelling out Titanic, there appear to be the faint, rusted outlines of the letters M and P, characters that belong to the Olympic. The theory isn't that a ghost ship sank, it's that a calculated corporate switch occurred to facilitate an insurance payout for a damaged vessel. By swapping the nameplates and internal fittings, which were remarkably interchangeable, the company could sail the wounded Olympic under the name Titanic, stage a controlled accident, and recoup the losses that the HMS Hawk collision had denied them. This would explain why the ship was being pushed at such reckless speeds through a known ice field. They weren't just trying to break a record, they were trying to meet a destination with destiny. Of course, the controlled part of the accident went horribly wrong. If you're sailing a ship that already has a warped keel and a patched-up hull from a previous collision, an iceberg isn't just a hazard, it's a death sentence. The official inquiries in 1912 were suspiciously quick to avoid any deep dive into the ship's construction history or its sister's recent repairs. They wanted a story of God's hand and an unlucky berg, not a story of a shell game played with 2,200 lives. It raises a chilling possibility. Was the most famous sinking in history actually a botched insurance scam? But even if the ship was a corporate decoy, how did a crew of seasoned veterans manage to miss a mountain of ice until it was too late to turn? The mirage of the iceberg. We often picture the night of April 14, 1912, as a clear, starlit stage where a massive white mountain of ice should have been visible for miles. The official narrative paints a picture of a perfectly calm sea where the only failure was a lack of binoculars or a momentary lapse in the crow's nest. But the physics of the North Atlantic suggests something far more haunting. The iceberg was effectively invisible, cloaked by a rare atmospheric phenomenon known as a cold water mirage. At the exact coordinates where the Titanic met her end, the frigid Labrador Current was colliding with the warm waters of the Gulf Stream. This created a thermal inversion, a layer of cold air trapped beneath a layer of much warmer air. For a navigator, this is a nightmare scenario. It creates what scientists call super-refraction, bending light downward and pushing the horizon line higher than it actually is. This creates a false haze that mimics the appearance of a clear horizon while simultaneously masking everything behind it. The photographs taken by passing ships the following morning show a peculiar, smoky band along the horizon, a visual fingerprint of this atmospheric trap. To the lookouts, fleet and lee, the sea and sky would have appeared to merge into a seamless, dark void. The iceberg wasn't just a white object in a black room. It was a black berg soaked in meltwater and shrouded by the distorted light of the mirage. By the time the berg broke through the refracted haze, it was less than 500 yards away. At 22 knots, that is a distance the Titanic could cover in less than 30 seconds. Both men insisted they had been staring at that exact spot for 20 minutes and saw nothing until the very last moment. The 1912 inquiry dismissed this as human error, but the meteorological records of the night tell a different story. They were looking through a literal lens of bent light that lifted the distant sea surface to hide the ice. This wasn't a failure of vision. It was a failure to understand the optical illusions of the deep. Furthermore, this mirage didn't just hide the iceberg from the Titanic, it hid the Titanic from the nearest potential rescuers. The officers on the nearby SS Californian reported seeing a ship that looked strange and too small to be a massive liner. They weren't seeing the Titanic, they were seeing a distorted, refracted version of her, shimmering in the thermal inversion like a ghost. The official story ignored the science of the atmosphere to keep the blame on the men on the bridge. If the atmosphere was playing tricks on their eyes, why didn't they have the one tool that could have pierced the gloom? The SS Californian mystery. If there is a true villain in the official record of the Titanic's final hours, it is usually painted as Captain Stanley Lord of the SS Californian. The traditional narrative is simple, almost cinematic in its tragedy. A small freighter sat just 10 to 19 miles away, its crew watching the Titanic's distress rockets streak across the sky, yet they did absolutely nothing. The 1912 inquiry savaged Captain Lord, effectively ending his career and branding him the man who let 1,500 people drown while he slept. But 110 years later, the official condemnation of the Californian looks less like a pursuit of justice and more like a convenient redirection of blame. When you look at the navigational logs and the photographs of the ice field taken the next morning, a different reality emerges. The Californian was surrounded by field ice, a massive shifting shelf of frozen white that had forced them to stop their engines entirely for the night. They weren't just sitting idle. They were physically trapped by the same elements that the Titanic had recklessly ignored. Furthermore, we have to look at the optical loophole we discussed in the previously. Because of the thermal inversion, the cold water mirage, the ship the Californian's crew saw on the horizon didn't look like a 900-foot luxury liner. To their eyes, refracted through layers of air at different temperatures, the vessel appeared to be a small, medium-sized steamer. When the Titanic fired its white distress rockets, the crew of the Californian didn't see high-altitude signals of a sinking ship. Due to the atmospheric bending of light, the rockets appeared to be low-lying flashes, standard company signals used by ships to identify each other in the dark, not a desperate plea for help. The official story also glosses over the Morse lamp failure. The Californian spent nearly an hour trying to signal the mystery ship with a high-powered lamp. The Titanic's officers also reported seeing a light and tried to signal back. Yet neither ship could read the other. Why? Because the shimmering, unstable air of the thermal inversion scrambled the light pulses into a flickering, unintelligible mess. By framing Captain Lord as a negligent coward, the 1912 inquiry successfully shifted the public's anger away from the White Star Line's lack of lifeboats and the Titanic's high-speed navigation. They needed a scapegoat to explain why help didn't arrive, and the Californian was the perfect target. Was the Titanic herself blinded by a simple, missing piece of equipment? The binocular key. In the high-stakes world of maritime safety, we like to imagine redundant systems and fail-safes. But sometimes, history hinges on a piece of metal no larger than a house key. One of the most glaring loopholes in the official 110-year narrative is the absurdly low-tech reason why the lookouts were essentially flying blind. Enter David Blair. He was originally assigned as the Titanic's second officer, but in a last-minute shakeup at Southampton, he was replaced by Henry Wilde of the Olympic. In the rush of the crew swap, Blair did something incredibly human and inadvertently catastrophic. He walked off the ship with the key to the lookout's locker in his pocket. Inside that locked cabinet was the only pair of high-powered binoculars intended for the crow's nest. When you look at the survivor testimony from lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, the official record treats their failure to spot the iceberg as a lapse in professional diligence. But these men were standing in a freezing slipstream at 22 knots, squinting into a pitch-black horizon with nothing but the naked eye. Fleet later testified that if they'd had those glasses, they could have spotted the berg enough to get out of the way. The 1912 inquiry downplayed this, claiming that binoculars were only for identifying objects, not finding them. It was a classic legal pivot to protect the White Star Line from a massive negligence claim. If the court admitted that the greatest ship in the world sank because of a missing key, the insurance payouts would have been astronomical. Instead, they framed the disaster as an act of God, an unavoidable collision with a stealth iceberg. But the photographs of the bridge equipment recovered from the debris field tell a different story of internal disorganization. The official story wants us to believe in a clockwork operation that was simply unlucky. The reality? The Titanic was a disorganized corporate rush job where a single pocketed key could, and did, override millions of dollars of engineering. If the eyes of the ship were failing, though, what about the very bones of the vessel itself? The metallurgy of 1912. We've all heard the legend. The iceberg was a jagged, diamond-hard monster that sliced the Titanic open like a tin can. The official story painted a picture of a continuous 300-foot gash along the hull, a catastrophic wound that no ship could survive. But when we look at the high-resolution sonar mapping and the recovered hull plates from the debris field 110 years later, the official narrative of a slice falls apart. There is no long gash. Instead, there is a series of small, jagged tears and popped rivets. Why does this matter? Because it reveals the greatest engineering lie of the Edwardian era, the myth of superior British steel. The steel used for the RMS Titanic was the best available in 1912, but by modern standards, it was chemically poisoned. Analysis of hull fragments shows high concentrations of phosphorus and sulfur. In the balmy waters of a shipyard, this steel is tough and flexible. But in the 28 degrees Fahrenheit graveyard of the North Atlantic, that specific chemical cocktail undergoes a ductile to brittle transition. Essentially, the steel loses its ability to bend and instead shatters like cold glass. When the iceberg struck, the hull didn't peel back. It buckled and shivered. This brings us to the real culprit the 1912 inquiry tried to ignore, the rivets. To save time and money during the frantic construction of the Olympic-class liners, the Harland and Wolff shipyard used best No. 3 iron rivets instead of the high-grade steel rivets used in the ship's central hull. These iron rivets were loaded with slag, stony waste material that makes the metal prone to snapping under pressure. The photographs of the wreck show that the gashes were actually the result of these cheap rivets popping like buttons on a tight shirt. As the hull flexed against the ice, the rivet heads sheared off, allowing the steel plates to simply pull apart. The official story blamed the size of the iceberg to avoid a massive scandal involving the quality of the materials. If the public knew the Unsinkable ship was held together by brittle iron and slag, the entire British maritime industry would have collapsed. They told us the iceberg was an unstoppable force. The reality? The ship was built with a glass jaw, and the men in the boardrooms knew exactly which corners had been cut to meet the launch deadline. Why did the subsequent legal inquiries seem so desperate to protect the status quo if the engineering was flawed and the crew was blinded? The cover-up. When the dust, or rather the salt spray, settled, the world demanded a villain. But in the wood-paneled rooms of the 1912 Mersey inquiry in London and the Senate hearings in Washington, the mission wasn't just to find the truth. It was to find a version of the truth that wouldn't sink the global economy. At the time, the White Star Line wasn't just a shipping company. It was a pillar of British prestige and a massive engine of American capital through J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine. If you look closely at the transcripts, the official story begins to look like a masterclass in legal gymnastics. The inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, was fundamentally a friendly investigation. The British Board of Trade, which was responsible for the very regulations that allowed the Titanic to sail with only 20 lifeboats, was essentially investigating itself. It's the ultimate conflict of interest. To find the White Star Line guilty of negligence would have meant admitting the Board of Trade's own rules were lethal. The strategy was simple: blame the unprecedented nature of the iceberg and the unfortunate inaction of the SS Californian. By focusing the public's rage on Captain Lord, a man with no corporate backing, the inquiry shielded the real architects of the disaster. They ignored the testimony of steerage passengers who described the locked gates that turned the lower decks into a tomb. They glossed over the binocular key debacle as a triviality. And they completely bypassed the coal fire evidence, because admitting the ship was structurally weakened before it left the dock would have voided every insurance policy on the Atlantic. The lost photographs we analyze today, the shots of the hull streaks, the porthole counts, the brittle fracture patterns, were largely absent from these hearings. They were inconvenient data points. Instead, the inquiry concluded that the ship was well built and the navigation was standard practice. It was a verdict designed to keep the status quo afloat. They turned a story of corporate corner-cutting and regulatory failure into a tragic act of God. But as the hull continues to dissolve in the dark, does the truth actually change the legacy of those who were lost? Comment your thoughts in the section below, and please subscribe to the channel for more upcoming videos.